In this video, we're going to look at the ramp command line interface and the batch scripting options for workflows within ramp. So we're going to use the workflow editor to create a template for our batch scripts. So let's just come up with a quick scenario. We're going to read an input file. This is a ramp binary grid. Ramp binary grid. And we're going to give it an output variable name. We'll call it raster. Input, we'll call it input raster. And then we're going to use a processor to say calculate the range, the localized range. So we'll go calculate the localized range. The input will be the input raster. The output will be the range raster. We'll use a kernel size of 9, and then let's write the result out to a new file. So we're going to write the range raster, and we're going to write it out to a bill format, and we're going to put it in the same folder. Let's just call it .range.bill. Okay, so if I was to run this now, it would go ahead and do a very simple thing. It's going to read that file, calculate the localized range using a 9x9 kernel, and output the result to a new file. Now, what if I wanted to iterate through many input files? Well, that's where batch scripting comes in. So let's just go ahead and save this workflow file. And now let's export it to a batch script. So in ramp you have a number of options for exporting workflows. You can export them to batch scripts, Python scripts, or in fact C#.NET applications, so that you can distribute them to others for their use. So let's look at the batch scripting option. It's asking me to look for a batch file, so I'm going to use a batch file that's in my C drive. And we'll call it example.bat. And it's asking me, do I want to predefine my working folder? So when I create a batch file, it's going to be using a utility called ramproc. Ramproc is a command line utility that allows you to access or execute any processor method from the command line. So but what it doesn't do is pass input and output rasters in memory. So everything has to be written to a file. So it does that by using a working folder where it can write temporary sort of scratch files and interchange files for the ramproc to be able to use. So let's just define that. We're going to say, all right, it's going to be sample data, batch working is going to be my folder. And then it's got a couple of options here. Do you want to clear the working folder prior to execution and clean it up after execution? All that's going to do is take your working folder and it's going to delete everything in there before it starts, and then it's going to delete everything in there before it completes. You've got to be careful because you need to isolate your working folder in that case, because if you were to output things into the working folder that you want to keep, and at the end of the workflow you delete everything, that's not a really good option. But in this case, we're going to allow it to clear the working folders prior to execution and at the completion of execution. Okay, so it's created that batch file. Let's go have a look at what that batch file looks like. So here's the batch file that the ramp GUI calculated for this particular workflow. You'll see that at the beginning it wants to switch directories to the ramp installation directory. It then wants to set the temporary folder, so we told it that we wanted to declare the temporary folder up front, so that's what I declared. And then it goes through and it deletes everything in the temporary folder. It then goes and reads the input file that we told it to read, so that was that particular input file. And it then goes ahead and calculates the range for that input file. By accessing it from the input file that's been created here during the read, by executing that through through the temporary file that it's created. So it's created a temporary output file using the variable name that I asked it to use, and it's written that into the temp folder. Then the range function is going to pick that up, process that temporary file, and output it to a new temporary file. And then finally, the last step is going to read that final temporary file and output it to the file that I asked it to output it to. Okay, that's great, but I mean, I could have just executed that using the normal workflow, like ramp flow, or just inside the graphical user interface. What if I wanted to do something a bit more fancy? What if I actually wanted this to loop through a whole folder of files and apply the same processing chain to each of those files within a folder? So let's go and have a look how we could do that. So firstly, you need to be familiar with the batch file scripting language. So batch is a very simple scripting language that is available in most Windows operating systems. And it allows you to introduce simple, to execute processes at the command line or through the command line, and then it also allows you to have very simple sort of control structures like for loops, and you can apply if-then type statements. So a very basic scripting language, but very handy nonetheless. Before we start iterating and putting a for loop in here, let's just have a look at one of the key things in here. You'll notice that when the batch file wants to do something with ramp, it calls an executable called ramproc. Let's have a look at what ramproc actually is. So I'm going to fire up the command line interface, and it's brought up a command window, and it's automatically gone to my ramp installation folder. If I look at all the executables in here now, you'll see the ones we talked about earlier with ramp flow in an earlier video. You'll see the ramp GUI, you'll see the ASCII data inspector, the ramp profile viewer, and there's something in here called ramproc, which is the utility that our batch script is executing. What ramproc is a utility that allows you to execute any ramp processor method that is registered in your installation. So if I just type ramproc, it's going to list for me. Well, firstly, it tells me how to call ramproc, but it's going to list for me all of the available processors in my ramp installation. So let's look at, for example, let's go ramproc now. If I was to type in, say, math, I didn't even have to use the full name of it. I can just use math. Let's see what it says now. So it's recognized that, you're talking about ramp.math. Cool, I can deal with that. And it said, okay, in the math processor, you have a series of different methods. And it describes each of those methods along with the method name here. So if I wanted to look at, say, transform in more detail, I simply go ramproc math transform. And then it lists all of the properties that are available for the transform, and tells you what data types they are. So I can now execute, say, the transform method, for example. And I do that by simply saying, okay, now specifying all of the parameters are in here. So for example, the input raster index equals, and now what I do is I give it the actual path to the input raster that I want to use. So let's use my sample data, I've forgotten the name. That's my favorite raster, and I'm going to tell it that's a bill file. So that's defined by input raster. So normally a processor would ask for the index of an input raster, but in this case what I'm doing is I'm giving it the actual full path to a raster, and I'm telling it at the end that it's a bill file. I then just need to specify all of the other arguments in here. So we're going to say pre-offset equals 0 equals 0 equals 0. Scalar equals, say, -1, so we're going to invert this in the transform, and then post offset equals, say, 10, so we're going to add 10 to the values in the input raster. Now I need to tell ramproc, now I've told it what processor and what method I want to execute. I also need to tell it where to put the output file. So I say output equals, and let's create, let's do this, e sample data, and we'll say ramproc example.bil, and I need to tell it, oh, whoops, executed that too early. I need to tell it that it's a bil file, and now I'm done. I can execute it. Let's see what happens. Done. So it basically executed the transform method, the transform processor method that's in the ramp.math processor. So that shows you how I can actually execute things at the command line, and it's the basis by which batch files are executed as well. So back to my batch file, you can see that it's using ramproc to execute conversion to read a raster, and then it's executing ramproc to use the local statistics processor to execute the range method, and then all of the different inputs that it needs for that, including the kernel size, etc. And then it's executing again the conversion and exporting it to a different file format. So pretty simple. Let's look now how we can modify this to allow for looping through a folder of files. So up here I'm going to set that right. Before it starts doing some work, let's say we're going to start a loop that reads all of the input, so ramp rasters in a folder. Okay, so we're going to use a for statement, which the batch language supports, and we're saying for every file in this input folder that ends with star.ramp, do the following thing. So we need to end this do, and that's that has a bracket that starts the do, and somewhere down here when we finish writing, we're going to end the do statement. So there we go. I will say rem end do loop. Okay. Unfortunately, I've just noticed that there are other brackets in here that I need to get rid of, otherwise it won't know where the end of the do loop is. So we'll just put these as square brackets instead. Okay, that's great. So it's looping through and it's getting each file, and each file will have this variable name. So let's just also echo here, echo processing, and then we'll say that variable. So it will tell us what file it's processing. And then we will tell it to read that input file. So where it says here input raster equals, we need to change that to the input file. So that was very simple. And where it's going to write something at the bottom here, we're going to tell it to write the same output file name, but append to it .range.bil. Okay, so I think we have a fully functioning batch file now that we can use that will read a whole file, a whole folder of files. Let's have a look at what the folder looks like first. Okay, so you can see there are a series of ramp files here called bathy 00011011. So I have 4 rasters that I'm going to process with this batch script, and it's going to write out new build files after I've processed each of these using the batch script that we've just created. This is the working folder, and this is my original workflow file. So let's go ahead and now run the modified batch file. So in my command line editor, I'm going to where I put that file. Let's have a look what's in here. There we go, it was called example.bat. So I'm just going to execute example.bat and see what happens. Done. And you'll notice if we scroll back up the list here, it said processing 00, and then later on, it's written it, processing 01. Let's read it, let's process the range, let's write it out to a new file, processing the next one. So this is a very quick example of how you can use RAMP to prototype a workflow, export it out to a batch file, and then modify that batch file to get it to do other things and loop through things and get different sort of different flow control and that sort of thing in your batch script. So this has been a quick video into batching using workflows and the Windows batch programming or scripting language, and also a little bit of an introduction into how to use ramproc at the command line. So I hope it's been useful, and I hope you make use of the very powerful way that you can now batch and chain together a whole series of processor methods in RAMP. Thanks for watching.